Good morning, and I better be on the right sheet. Good morning, and welcome to our. Oh, I am in the wrong place. What a great start! It's a busy week. The 21st meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can we ask that everybody ensures that electronic devices are switched to silent? This morning, we've received apologies from Rhoda Grant. Before we move on to our first item, members may have seen that the Bureau motion lodged yesterday relating to Elena leaving the committee. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Elena for her much valued work on the committee in the time she's been here, and wish you luck in the committees that you're going to be taking your place in. So thank you very much. Our first item on the agenda is to agree to consider to take item 4 at today's meeting, and the draft report on Environmental Scotland Bill at today's meeting and future meeting in private. Agreed. Thank you. Our next item of business is to consider two negative instruments: the Seed Fees Scotland Amendments Regulation 2025 and the Marketing of Fruit, Plant and Propagating Materials Scotland Amendment Regulation 2025. Do any members wish to make any comment on these instruments? Tim.
Sorry, convener, just to be slightly awkward. See the the seed fees one. I've no issue with that, but do we happen to know, out of interest, what the equivalent costs are in other countries for this? I mean, there was no consultation responses. I was just curious.
No, but we could certainly try and find that out for you.
I just wondered if it was fair, effectively, because it's quite a 6-point-something% increase, isn't it? So I'm always cautious of cost.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the cost. However, I would suggest that, given that none of the responses or nothing was highlighted as to a cost that was extraordinary, it was received. So I would assume that it was in line with other countries, but it's certainly something we can find out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. There's no further comments. No. Okay, our third item on the agenda is an evidence session with industry stakeholders to discuss the recent EU-UK cooperation agreement. And this morning, welcome to the meeting, Jimmy Buchan from the Scottish Seafood Association, Johnny Hall from the National Farmers Union of Scotland, Jennifer Howie from the Food Standards Scotland, Patrick Hughes from the Scottish Agricultural Organisation Society, Stephen Kenyon from Agricultural Industries Confederation Scotland, Elspeth MacDonald from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, James Park from Salmon Scotland, David Thompson from Food and Drink Federation Scotland, Scott Walker from the Scottish Association of Meat Wholesalers and GB Potatoes, and finally Adam Wing from Seafood Scotland. We've allocated around about 2 hours for the discussion this morning. We do have quite a few questions to get through, so if we could ask everybody to be succinct in their questions and answers. And please do indicate to myself or the clerks if you wish to participate at any point. And there's not any expectations for you to comment on every question. And if the point's already been made, if you just want to indicate that that's the case. You also don't need to operate your microphones. We've got a gentleman here that will do that for you. So we'll kick off with some questions. A nice, simple one to begin with. It's just to ask a general question of the situation we're in at the moment, the issues that arose on the back of Brexit, and how this new EU UK agreement might affect the ability to export agri products and also seafood products to the EU market, particularly considering the cost element. Who would like to kick off? Patrick.
Well, good morning and thank you for the invitation. I sort of represent the seed potato export committee. Community. Generally, what's happened since Brexit is that the seed potatoes have been prohibited from entering the EU market. So this is simply good news. It's approximately 20,000 tonne market to the seed industry. So therefore, it's welcome news that there's a possibility of coming back into it.
Thank you. Johnny, and then Scott.
Yes, Convener, just a very general comment to kick off with. Obviously, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is getting on for 5 years old now, was obviously sold as being about being tariff-free and quota-free, but it was never going to be friction-free, to use that expression. And the issues around the sanitary and phytosanitary arrangements are evidence of that, and how that's caused additional costs and various issues in terms of the trade flows from the UK and from Scotland into Europe, which haven't been reciprocated the other way. It's been a bit of a one-way street in that respect, if I can call it that. And without going into the specific issues that Patrick and others might talk about, but in general, as an opening comment, we certainly have long argued that there needed to be something of a reset, and therefore the agreement to reach an agreement, and I will stress that, on the 19th of May was very much a welcome step. But of course, to use another cliche, the devil will be in the detail. And as such, we don't know the timing of when things will be finally sorted out, and indeed what the entire scope of the new agreement will be. We're told that there'll be various bits and pieces in there about SPS, plant protection products and other things as well, organics, for example, and that there's certain things that will not be in scope within that, wider environmental regulations and so on. So there's still a lot to play for in this. It's an important and it's a positive step, but there's still lots to play for, and no doubt we'll come back to some of those issues as we go through the morning.
Just on that, what role or involvement have NFUS had with the UK government? And are you confident that it will result in a two-way frictionless agreement? Because at the moment, as you say, there appeared to be less restrictions on exporting than there was, more requirements on exporting than there were on products coming back into the country. Are you confident that's going to be the case, and what involvement's NFUS got in ensuring that would be the case?
Well, we've had, I would argue, limited involvement in processes so far. On specifics, such as seed potatoes, for example, we have lobbied hard in terms of the UK government and taken our argument across to the European Commission in Brussels over the last 3 or 4 years. Quite often, certainly at European Commission level, we were just given a shut door, if you like, and that was very much the case. But the agreement to reach an agreement, as I say, probably gives us a bit of renewed confidence that we can iron some of those things out and get the two-way flow of agri-food products onto an even footing. Instead of it all about being checks when we are exporting to Europe, whereas European product coming into the UK just carried on our business as usual, we want to get that back into kilter. Our involvement in some of those processes, we've done that very much in conjunction with the other farming unions across the UK. Perhaps not so much our colleagues in Northern Ireland, because they've been focused more on the Windsor Framework and things like that. We've been looking at GB issues rather than UK issues. But nevertheless, we've worked with other farming unions, and we've also coordinated a lot of that through our office in Brussels. So limited, I would say, so far. We've had briefings from DEFRA, but in terms of actually taking us with us in terms of what the detailed discussion will look like, I'm still concerned that we might not have seats at tables when it matters.
Okay. Scott.
First of all, just on potatoes, so I fully endorse everything Patrick has said about potatoes. The other thing potatoes would just flag up at this stage as well, which we might discuss further, is that before the political agreement was discussed, there was an application put in by the UK government for market access application to allow seed potatoes to be once more sold in Europe and vice versa, European seed potatoes sold back in this country. My understanding is that application is still going through the process just now. Given that we don't have an agreed timeline on the current agreement for the trade deal, we'd ask that both these routes be pursued, so that if something were to come off the wheels, say, of the trade agreement, we still have this market access application route for seed. So that's on potatoes. With regards to meat, As soon as we left Europe, there was a few things that happened in terms of meat that we think now will be resolved. So the first thing to highlight was that for small meat producers, what they used to do was consolidate loads that went to Europe. Overnight, that stopped. One, because of cost, and two, more importantly, because of the inspections that took place. And if one of those loads, there was an issue flagged up at the ports, what that meant was the entire vehicle was turned down. So if you were an exporter who had to export with another, say, half a dozen companies, just for example, the risk was too great. So that stopped overnight. Once this agreement comes into force, we expect that to start, which gives a lot of opportunities to smaller exporters to restart that export situation. So that's very good. The other thing then with the big exporters, it was the problems, one of the cost of the export health certificates and having vets to sign them, but more so just about the delays in getting products to market. So whereas it was seamless for sending a truckload, whether it was from Aberdeenshire to Birmingham or Aberdeenshire to Frankfurt, it used to be seamless. All of a sudden, there were delays put in place. So that made it more difficult to actually meet the market requirements abroad. There was those problems. Again, we expect those issues to be resolved. So from both the meat and potato side, from myself, we expect this agreement to be good news.
Okay, thanks. I should say that the first hour is probably going to be focused around the SPS and the second half on fisheries, just to make that clear. Scott, we talked about, and the figures would suggest that exports excuse me, were down by about 21%. Have you got any idea what attributed to that 21%? Was it generally small businesses that had concerns about batching loads, if you like? And is there still the desire out there, and these businesses still looking forward to resume some of these exports? How much are we going to get back?
So it's a difficult one. So I think it was across the board. So it wasn't just small businesses. It was businesses of all sides who had to pull back. And, for example, with certain export markets where it just became difficult to supply on the timescale that was required. So we will start getting back that business, but it takes time. You know, once you've lost business, to actually reclaim that business back, to get those suppliers to have confidence again that you can supply that market and supply that market on a consistent basis is not something that could be done overnight. There is a desire to sell back to Europe. It's the most important market for both beef and sheep meat exports, and it's a huge important part of carcass balance. So the market will come back. In terms of the value and the time, I wouldn't like to put a scale on it. I think the biggest problem, though, that the meat industry will face is actually volume. So during this time that we've been out of Europe, actually the volume of livestock within Scotland and the UK has declined. So the opportunity for us to sell abroad is we don't have the product that the marketplace wants.
Thank you. James Park and then David Thompson.
Thank you, Convener, for your time to let us contribute on behalf of Salmon Scotland. We're very supportive of the agreement. Obtaining an SPS agreement would remove a lot of the costs and bureaucracy that exporters currently face. Includes physical checks, export health certificates, and packaging interpretations as well. This will benefit not just exporters but European consumers alike. Aligned with the Prime Minister's suggestion to implement the deal at pace would be welcome, but as has already been highlighted, the devil will be in the detail. Europe's our biggest market, with around 2/3 of our exports going to Europe. So making sure that we continue to supply European consumers is important. And I think more broadly, it's helped support the broader supply chain in terms of those lower costs. And the supply chain around Scotland is very diverse, touching every constituency. So lower bureaucracy, lower costs means there's more incentive for investment in the sector.
Thank you. David.
So speaking on behalf of food and drink manufacturers who take all the excellent primary produce from Scotland that we've been talking about, in general, we think that an SPS deal is likely to reduce bureaucracy, reduce costs and reduce paperwork. So therefore, it's in principle, it's a good thing. What we don't, as Johnny said, what we don't really know is what the detail of that is. And in particular, the agreement goes much further than just solely an SPS deal. So it seems to cover food safety and general consumer protection, regulations on live animals, regulations on pesticides, rules on organics, marketing standards. So a wider range of regulation than a strict SPS deal would have. And I think where we have potential concerns is in that broader range of areas where the UK has signalled it would like to dynamically align with the European Union on the regulation. So if a really high-quality deal is done that understands the needs of Scottish and UK businesses there, then that's positive. But at the moment, we just don't know the detail. I don't think any of us know the detail in terms of that impact. And we do have live cases where European regulation has gone further now than the UK regulation, which would have a direct impact on Scottish businesses. So how the negotiations deal with that particular point and how they then deal with dynamic alignment and whether the UK has any say in ongoing European regulation, which might negatively impact one of our sectors, is the bit that we just don't know the detail of. And we're particularly concerned that where European rules impact British businesses, that we do have a say in that going forward.
I think this is an appropriate time to bring out. I've got a supplementary from Tim Eagle and then Emma Harper.
It was actually convenient on this very point. So I think most of us presumably agree the SPS agreement in itself is fine, but there is this risk, isn't it, of this dynamic alignment? And actually, what does that mean? I guess that was my question. What are the potential risks that could come? If you sort of looked through the looking glass, what are the potential risks that could come to businesses, whether that be farmers or your own members?
Well, I can illustrate that by a real risk that exists. At the moment, European legislation has moved forward on regulations for maximum residue levels for mycotoxins in oats and a whole range of other products. What that means is there is now a maximum residue level for those mycotoxins in European regulation. There is not in UK regulation. And because of the type of mycotoxin, T2H, T2 in oats, what that means is that is more prevalent in a colder, wetter climate, i.e. Scotland, Ireland, places like that. If those rules were to be brought into the UK as part of dynamic alignment, that would be of significant concern to oat millers and manufacturers and processors who use those oats, because the difficulty of testing for and finding that level of mycotoxin, which is a very, very small amount in the oats, means that perhaps their businesses become unviable in Scotland. So that's one piece of European regulation that was applied directly to the UK would have a negative effect. And that's one tiny bit of technical regulation on food safety. And as we know, there are lots and lots of regulations on food safety that go and move on in Europe all the time. So the question really is, as number one, how will the UK government deal with that real issue there? And number two, how will the UK government be able to significantly influence ongoing European regulation that changes whatever standard it might be for any food product or any type of farming as we go forward. So previously, when we were in Europe, we had a direct seat at the table. What will happen with this new deal?
Johnny, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add to David's comments there, in some contexts it gets even more complicated than just the alignment, if you like, between the UK and Europe. And I'm thinking particularly of precision breeding or gene editing, because we don't have an aligned system within the UK on that. With England, with its Precision Breeding Act now in place, forging ahead on the implementation of using gene-edited techniques, Europe is moving in that direction, but at a different pace. They call them new genomic techniques, NGTs. And Scotland, we're still in the starting blocks. We haven't even left the start line on some of this. So it gets even more complicated than David's point about the UK and Europe. There's going to be, or there has the potential for, different levels of regulatory standards around things like precision breeding and gene editing between Scotland, England and Brussels, if you like. And therefore, I know it's a cliche, it's one I've used a lot, how do you square that triangle? It's going to be quite interesting. And this committee has debated and other committees in this place have debated the issues around the Internal Market Act and how they might play out. So that all becomes quite important once you really get into the nitty-gritty of these things. And I would also echo and support exactly what David said about a seat at the table. This is about rules, essentially. We want to be able to share common rules in many ways. That's what alignment would be. But we may not have any say in what those rules are. And that has clearly got to be a risk for certainly the agri-food sector of Scotland.
James.
Thank you. Yeah, after what David and Johnny have said, would agree. No contest on any of that. With Europe being our biggest market, it's a case of to some degree, we have to take what rules they currently enforce and what they're currently enforcing today, and that's what we do. Trying to influence them in the position that we're in at the moment is something that we do on a regular basis. And so having a warmer relationship, a more progressive relationship with the European Union, and looking to try and have those influences is something that we should continue to do in the future.
And Elspeth indicated, then I'll bring Emma in for our supplementary. Elspeth.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. And I know we're going to come on to fisheries later on, but just on this matter of the agreement to have discussions about an SPS agreement. Again, I think we see some risks there around just again, I think Johnny said, the devil being in the detail. What will be the extent of that potential dynamic alignment? How far back the chain will it go? And, for example, is that going to potentially cut across some of the work, of which there's been a great deal of work ongoing across the UK, around things like fisheries management plans in terms of how we now want to manage our fisheries in the UK under the UK Fisheries Act. So I think there's a long way to go on this. I think many of my members would be exercised about the prospect of the EU perhaps trying to loop the UK in some shape or form back into some of the common fisheries policy requirements. So I think there is a long way to go. There's absolutely going to be a lot of devil in the detail. And I think we will all need to be really vigilant and sort of closely engaged in this work, and hope that governments will fully engage industry in it.
Emma.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to everybody. David mentioned costs, and I'm just thinking about what has been the costs. I know that I'm looking at the Salmon Scotland said it's about £100 million a year that has been the cost to industry. So what are we talking about in terms of cost? How many millions are we talking about?
Yeah, so there's a case of it being, I think on average around 500 trucks of salmon go across the short straits to Europe each week. And each of those currently has an export health certificate associated with it. And then there's also the physical checks that are required. So that estimate is, I think, on the conservative side of what the costs are on an annual basis. There's also, if there's any delays, it also reduces the shelf life that the product has for consumers. So there's a combination of factors, and with those regular delays, it's been a case of a bit of reputation management as well. That you have regular customers that expect consignments to arrive on time, and if that doesn't happen, then they'll look elsewhere for products. So there's a combination of factors that are taken into account.
Thank you. Okay. Jimmy.
Just to support what James is saying on costs, that some of the pelagic factories that I've been speaking to of late said that this additional cost has been upwards of 250 to 500,000 per annum per business So it's quite a considerable cost that has to come out the top line. And in the new agreement, if it is what we think or we wish it to be, then it's good. But it's the unknown. And we're all thinking it's going to be a reset to where we were. And I'm a bit sceptical that it won't be that simple. I have a funny feeling we will get a more frictionless border, but I don't think it'll be free of friction.
Do we run the risk of, and because there will be a cost element to this to the UK, because they'll have to pay for some of the policy development going forward for these EU rules. And we talk about the SPS regulations, maybe the food hygiene regulations and what a definition of organic is, but could you go further and we then look at how our food and fisheries businesses in the UK actually operate financially, regulatory? We will look at workforce and how you employ staff, what the working environment is. Do you think that we could end up becoming a big issue? We're not just looking at food standards, it's a lot more than that. Johnny?
I think, Convener, you're touching on a point which I was going to make in response to Emma Harper's question in around we can probably measure relatively easy what the costs of things like export health certificates are and what does that mean in sort of pounds, shillings and pence. But I'd go back to Scott's earlier point about the fact some of the real costs of all this have been what we've lost in terms of market over the last 4 or 5 years, in particular from whether it's red meat or sweet potatoes or whatever that might be. I suspect we'll never get a real handle on that. And then, as you quite rightly identify, if this becomes an issue about adopting new regulatory requirements or whatever standards, there's always going to be some element of cost associated with those. So it's something we need to be mindful of. There needs to be, when we go through any negotiation or have any influence in the process, seat at the table or not, we need to understand what the implications will be on the supply chain, not least from our point of view, the primary producer, of adhering to regulatory requirements. Now, that's not to say we need to push back against regulatory requirements, far from it, but they always come at some cost to business somewhere, and I think that's something that we need to be mindful of going forward.
Okay. I'm going to bring in Adam, then Mark's got a supplementary, and Patrick, I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Convener. So we estimated the cost per shipment to be in the region of £600, and this meant that the market became essentially null and void for smaller businesses. It was impossible for them to meet the cost when they were sending via groupage. So Scott mentioned earlier the risk around groupage, whereby one consignor's product, an issue with one consignor's product could affect a whole shipment, but also there was a significant issue around the cost, which essentially made the market inaccessible for many smaller businesses, and they largely ceased trading with the EU on that basis, which meant that some businesses went out of business and others looked elsewhere, further afield.
Okay, thank you. Mark, and then I'll come to Patrick.
Yes, I was interested in your different sectors' views on the proposed Rosyth-Dunkirk ferry, whether you think that would be beneficial for trade, and in particular how you think an SPS agreement might actually help in terms of location of border control posts, or maybe even make some posts, irrelevant, I guess, going forward. Would that help with frictionless trade? Would it help the case for the ferry to get over the line if there was implementation of that? Jimmy, do you want to come in?
I've always been a great advocate of us having some sort of direct route into the EU from Scotland. None more so when we see that there can be possible chokes or civil disruption in the BCPs. All these things create problems, especially when you're dealing with a time-sensitive product or a live product. And therefore, we should always have a contingency of a plan B. And that plan B, because Scotland so depends on live and fresh seafood getting to market day one for day 2 delivery or day 3 delivery is really vital. And therefore, I think we should always be looking at new routes into market so that we are not held up in that respect. So I would certainly, for the industry that I champion support, it is something that we should be seriously considering.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Patrick.
So just to go back on a previous point that Emma Harper made, the lost opportunity, it's more about the lost market opportunity, certainly for sea potatoes. We estimate that for the last 5 years, it's probably currently running at about £75 million of lost income. Now that will continue to grow over the next number of years whilst the details worked out, and we still don't have access to that market, and it will take time to build that market up. There will be costs as well, because we didn't have to issue phytosanitary certification to the EU market previously, so growers will have to do that. I think what probably was more important is to actually make sure that we have a system that is suitable and adequate to make sure that we meet the demand when it moves forward. Our system is dated and slow in terms of issuing phytosanitary certificates, and we've got an opportunity now to actually make sure that it's fit for purpose moving forward.
Thank you. I'm going to move now. Oh, beg your pardon, Stephen.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity. Just on behalf of AIC, I think we would concur with a lot of what's been said, in that it feels positive, but I think I said devil in the detail to Johnny earlier, I can't remember, but everyone's saying it. It's what does this actually look like? But I think a few things. We've had some divergence of rules. So, you know, I've just got through from the guys at AIC. There are currently 30 plant protection products approved in GB that are not approved in the EU, and 67 on the other side. So that's the sort of detail that needs sorting out. We're also, I think, looking forward, very concerned about what say we will have in the rules. There was particularly in certain sectors, and animal feed would be one. The UK always had a strong voice in Europe and was sort of one of the put an awful lot of effort into those rules, and the EU would have come up with suggestions over the years that would have impacted Scotland. I remember they wanted to lower cobalt levels in animal feed, which would have been very detrimental, particularly to our sheep. And we have a very specific market there that nobody else in Europe has, so they're not that concerned. And we lobbied hard and got that changed. But we then had a seat at the table. If we don't have a strong seat at that table and a say, then there's a potential risk that rules are brought into play that would be detrimental. And we're aware of one specific one at the moment. The EU are considering lowering selenium levels in animal feed, and that we believe would have a negative effect on livestock health and performance, but also on the subsequent flow of selenium into humans, and therefore potentially human health. And Scotland has a specific problem with selenium deficiencies. So it's the detail of all of this that's going to be important.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Elena Whittam.
Convener, and apologies to everybody, I will need to nip out to another committee, but I will be coming back. I'm interested in understanding just the level of investment perhaps that your sector, your members have made in terms of supply chain infrastructure and technology, and how that's helped to reduce barriers to trade over the last few years, but also how this agreement might impact on what yourself, your sector, your members are planning to do in that investment space.
Patrick, do you want to kick off?
We
That's
haven't
what
had
happens
access
when
to
you
the
nod.
we haven't had access to the market, but I suppose from the seed potatoes sector, the investment has been on to a certain degree automation, automatic grading, sort of optical graders that time, simply to reduce the workforce, to make farms more efficient. So that's probably been the main area of investment within businesses. When I talk about the seed potato sector not having access to the EU market, it has grown over the last number of years because it sought its increase its market share in Egypt, for example. So it's still a very important sector. It's got a bit of a symbiotic sort of relationship with the homegrown seed that we need for UK production. If we didn't have export markets, then we would be at this sort of situation where the critical mass wouldn't necessarily be enough to support the entire sector. We would probably lose agronomists, we would probably lose sort of plant protection products, etc. So having that sort of symbiotic relationship with a good, healthy home market and a good, healthy export market are critical moving forward.
Okay. James.
Thanks for the question, Elena. I think in terms of investment, it would be a positive thing if it's making trade with Europe more efficient. Our members certainly have got a good history in terms of investing in Scotland, in terms of the whole farming process. The supply chain as well is really important. So it goes beyond the SPS agreement of the UK EU agreement. The piece on education and workforce as well is an important part of it. So I think by creating a business environment that encourages trade and makes processes more effective and efficient, it would be a positive thing from our sector.
Thank you. Jimmy.
I think there's two sides to the story. Robotics and automation is certainly a huge help for possibly larger businesses who are dealing in volume, but we must also remember we've got a huge coastline of artisan fishermen who employ good husbandry, and it's the skill of the grower, the catcher, the producer to ensure that the live crustacean and the likes is well looked after, well packed, and sent onwards to market. So there's two huge variations in the seafood supply chain, where one is very much industrialised and the other is very much niche, and that's what makes Scotland unique. So I see that there are two different sides to that particular question about investment. The investment should be always in the people, because they are the people that will drive the business.
Thank you. Scott.
Yeah, I think for the meat side, when we looked at Brexit and what occurred, you've got a business that operates on a very small margin, and all Brexit did was bring in a huge amount of extra cost. So, people who used to be, say, looking at developing markets, looking at selling products abroad, what they actually turned their attention to was actually filling in the paperwork for sending the product abroad. So there was huge extra cost taken up to the business, which diverted from money that could have otherwise have been invested in the business to make it more efficient. So we would be expecting, speaking to certainly some of the larger processors, that the teams that they've had to put together, in essence, to comply with the paperwork regime that is necessary. Some of those teams could, in essence, be either scaled back or disbanded, which then frees up cash for investment into the business. What people do need, though, is long-term certainty. Because if they are going to invest in a meat business, it's not just for this year or next year, it's long-term. And so whether they look at this deal or they look at the entire package, what they're looking is, what's the environment going to be here in Scotland to investment. And again, certainly speaking on my meat side, most of the meat processors or large meat processors here in Scotland have operations in Scotland, operations in the rest of the UK and operations outside the UK. So they'll be looking at where is the best place to invest for in the future. They're willing to do it. They know the demand's there. But is Scotland an attractive environment for that money to be invested in? I think just going back to St Patrick on potatoes and the issues that he's brought up, one of the things to sort of bear in mind is that I think the sweet potato industry has been very resilient. And Patrick's, been sort of that forefront of doing some of this. So diverted to Egypt being a key market. But what that has meant is different varieties. So these aren't varieties of potatoes that are used here in GB and not varieties of potatoes that are used across in Europe. So what you're asking the industry to do now is to, swerve back and to look at growing varieties of potatoes that the European market will want. So, one, that takes time. So, people are looking now saying, when will this agreement be put in place? So, at this moment in time, no one is investing for the European market because they don't know if this agreement will be put in place 3 months, 6 months or 18 months from now. So the sooner we have time scale, the sooner we have certainty, I think you'll see, certainly on the sweet potato side, investment once more flowing into Scotland.
Thank you. Jennifer Howie.
Thanks, Convener. Obviously, the perspective of FSS is a little different as a regulator in terms of investment made, but when we left the EU, investment did have to be made in terms of the processes and systems that had to be put in place to, by way of risk analysis, for example, to consider issues such as David's alluding to in terms of contaminant levels in foods, to process market authorisations in relation to animal feed, additives and so on. So significant expertise has been built up in relation to that. We anticipate that the proposed deal would impact that, but we need to see the detail as to what that means, because the implementation of any deal might be quite resource intensive too. But just from the perspective of the regulator, we had to put in place from the public purse a significant investment to deal with the consequences of EU exit. Thank you.
Elspeth.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I just wanted to touch on this issue of sort of investment and innovation, and I think certainly, Jimmy's spoken already about seafood businesses, but I think certainly some of the processors that I have some contact with, we've seen examples in recent years where there's been significant investment in automation and trying to find innovative ways of processing, but it's been more focused on trying to address issues with labour shortages and how to deal with a situation whereby you've got products that require perhaps quite a lot of manual processing, filleting, for example. How can that be automated? And I think there's been some considerable investment in some of the factories in the North East to try and address that. And then also, I think, in another area, very much looking for sort of trying to find innovative solutions to processing small haddock, for example, that require otherwise a large workforce to do it. If that workforce isn't available, what might the technological solutions to that be? So there's certainly been innovation, investment in innovation and automation on that front that I think is also very relevant.
So on the back of it, because of the, if we want to look at, if you want to look at any positives that might have come out of Brexit, it may be that some of our businesses are actually leaner because they've needed to be more conscious of the costs of getting their products to Europe and the various additional costs that we've already heard about. So if we have a more frictionless, a friction-free trading agreement, would it mean that actually Scottish companies are more competitive? They're going to be leaner because of the results of having to tighten their belt because of the additional cost to Europe? Are we going to be putting ourselves in a better position? Jimmy?
We are one of the most expensive countries to produce food, and it's because of cost of it's not only employment. There are business rates and all the other hidden taxes that come with being in business. So we find ourselves very uncompetitive in a global market. and therefore, you're right, the business has become leaner, but we still struggle to become a profitable primary supply chain industry, especially in seafood.
Okay, thank you. Scott.
Yeah, I don't believe that Brexit was a driver for efficiency in, say, the meat trade. I think in terms of any meat business, they're always looking to drive efficiency. So, the best example I would give is any meat business who goes to a retailer and says the prices of production have gone up, we need to put through a price increase. The first thing the retailer will say to them is, what are you putting in place to mitigate those increases? And they would expect a plan to have been put in place to reduce as many of those costs wherever possible. So I think the marketplace drives its own efficiency, not Brexit. I think for me, I think where there is an opportunity, and we've got good discussions with Food Standards Scotland on this, is looking at the regulatory regime within Scotland and within the UK. How could it be modernised going forward? So, for instance, in the meat industry, in essence, we're regulating the same in the meat industry as we were doing 30, 40, 50 years ago. But the industry has massively changed. There was, because of need during COVID, a lot more flexibility that was introduced, but post-COVID, those sort of flexibilities have been wound back again. And I think there is the opportunity with AI and new technology to look at different ways that, not only just maintains food safety, but actually improves food safety, and potentially does that at lower cost, and potentially does that in a way that the regulator can better meet the commercial needs of business.
Thank you. Patrick.
We have a unique sort of selling point when it comes to growing agricultural products such as seed potatoes, because we are further north, we're in a cooler climate, we've got greater daylight, less pressure from pests. So we do have a competitive advantage when it comes to our main competitors in the Netherlands, Germany and France, etc. The sort of caveat to all that is our distance to market. So we then have to ship that product, whether it's from Grangemouth to Rotterdam and onward into Europe, or whether it's through the short straits. That comes at an additional cost. So we have to, as Scott mentioned earlier, we're going to have to build from a zero base once again, and therefore we're going to have to make sure that our competitive, or at least our unique selling points, are well communicated, because we do have that sort of added pressure of being further away from the marketplace.
Thank you. Maybe a question from Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. Looking at the SPS agreement, are there any specific products that might benefit more than others? And I don't know who might want to take that.
Jimmy.
The live seafood market would be a clear winner in that, if we can speed up the process through the BCPs and into wider Europe. So they would definitely be a clear winner in market, speed to market. And also to reduce, if the checks are taken away, then these are all things that restrict and frustrate the industry. And, of course, the customer who's waiting to have that product on their shelves or in the restaurant. So that would be one of the clear beneficiaries of any new reset.
Okay.
Yes, just on a couple of things. So there are, as we've already discussed with seed potatoes, there are a couple of things that can be exported at the moment, and that includes also things like chilled meats and others. And we would see, the biggest winners are going to be fresh primary produce as a result of this, because of the health checks and the need for those to be fresh. And both of those, the reduction in time and the reduction in paperwork there are going to be critical, as well as allowing things like chilled meats, sausages and things like that into Europe, again, in a way that hasn't been allowed as a part of the current rules.
Okay, I move to a question. You don't have a supplement?
No, that's fine.
Thank you. Tim Eagle.
It was just really to follow up on Alina's question, really. I guess probably more for Jimmy than anybody else. They were quite interested to see if there is an agricultural sort of product point of view as well. But to what extent do you think processors in Scotland will benefit from the deal in terms of, do you think, I think in our notes, 68% reduction of landings by foreign vessels into Scotland. Do you think you'll see more product coming to UK processors and then shipped on to Europe because of the deal?
Well, I think there's a risk to the deal because at the end of the day, processors need raw material.
Yeah.
If the restriction is now, which was anticipated from Brexit, that there would be some sort of repatriation of more food, and I think Elspeth would be a better place to comment on that, then that is the opportunity for the whole supply chain to grow. That now looks like it will be thwarted, and therefore, if processors need to grow, there is only two ways it can happen. We either value add these products and make sure that the economy grows through adding value to raw material, or the same processor has to start importing raw material, which then makes the market a bit more competitive. And as I say, we operate in a global market. So all things come with risks. The natural obvious was that on Brexit, on a new deal, there would have been more raw material, and everyone from seed to plate would have been the beneficiaries of that. That now changes the dynamic, and therefore business is very good at looking for new opportunities and new ways to grow and evolve.
Yeah. Okay.
James?
Yeah, I think in terms of adding value to the processing, the supply chain, there's certainly a positive from a salmon perspective. Having more cost-effective routes into Europe would be a clear benefit. Further processing in the likes of Fort William or Rosyth, really beneficial to the sector, and reducing those costs, I think, would being in control of what we're in control of is something that's important, given the geopolitical volatility that's happening at the minute. So since 2019, salmon exports to Europe has increased by 18% in volume terms. So there's around £500 million worth of salmon going to the EU. That was last year. The wider fish and shellfish exports have reduced by the best part of 30%. So having a more efficient supply chain, that could increase we could revive some of the wider fishing exports and make it more competitive.
Thank you. Can I just, before we move on, I know Paddy wants to come in, it's probably a question to Jimmy again. If we've got freer access for processed Scottish product, could that result in an increase in EU boats landing fish directly to Scotland rather than bypassing Scotland because of potential barriers to get into the market on time?
That's a difficult question. It depends on the companies who are fishing the catch, because sometimes the catches are landed into Scottish ports, but bypass everything and go direct to the processor in Spain or France or in wider Europe. So, and other vessels will transship go direct back into the EU to land the fish. So. We do get some vessels landing into the EU, into Scottish ports, and that fish does find its way into the supply chain. But it's not, by and large, our processors depend on raw material being landed around the coastline to supply our communities with raw material to sell onwards.
Okay, Elspeth, did you have a view on?
Yeah, I agree with Jimmy. I think it's very hard to say what might happen in the future. I think that would be sort of business decisions for those EU fishing vessels who will have plenty of opportunity to catch fish in our waters that unfortunately our fleet now will not be able to catch and will not be able to provide into our domestic processors, because that potential uplift in raw material that Jimmy has alluded to, would have been raw material that was available for Scottish processors, and we do not know and have no control over what the EU fleet will do with the fish that they catch in the UK EEZ.
we'll come to that shortly. Patrick, and then I'll come to Adam.
Thank you. Just to go on a previous point that was raised by Tim Eagle, and sort of to follow up what Scott said about variety development, we have a high health planted area in Scotland, so we protect that. So therefore, anything that is grown from a seed potato point of view, it has to originate in Scotland, whether that through nuclear stock or through growing through mini tuber facilities before being planted into the ground. So yes, there potentially is opportunity to bring in material for nuclear stock purposes to then grow sort of new varieties through that way. We've been restricted in our access to new varieties because of Brexit, and therefore having those new varieties and then growing them from nuclear stock onwards in Scotland could be advantageous.
Thank you. Adam.
Just on the point made by James around the decline in fish and shellfish exports to Europe since Brexit, what I would I'd like to make a point around where James mentioned that now presents an opportunity with the New Deal. Many businesses did go out of business as a result. Like I mentioned, around the smaller companies that really relied on Europe as a market. And in addition to that, many businesses looked elsewhere. They looked further afield to markets such as Asia, the Middle East, North America. And so with the customer bases they have now established and standing still in terms of the raw material that is coming in, I wouldn't necessarily hold out a lot of hope that they would return to Europe on that basis. It does certainly present an opportunity. However, there will be choices that they have to make. Do they stick with the customers they've found, or do they return to Europe? Because, as pointed out by Elspeth and Jimmy, the raw material is at a standstill, essentially.
Okay, thank you. Johnny.
Just to make what might appear to be a very general point, but obviously this discussion is entirely valid, and we're looking at very much through the lens of the implications for the Scottish agri-food sector, the fisheries sector and all the rest of it, and what it might mean for the UK in order to, if you like, get back to that pre-Brexit situation as best we can because of the opportunities we want to identify and see come to fruition. And we've identified that there are risks and there's uncertainties and there's costs and all these other issues. I'm also very mindful about the fact that the EU has moved here. It's not just the UK government or indeed ourselves that are pushing for this agenda. I was fortunate enough to meet last week the EU ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was in Scotland, and met him on farm, had a very constructive conversation, and a lot of it was around this. And there's clearly, if we think about the big geopolitical events that are happening in the world anyway, there's clearly an appetite from the EU point of view to make this work better, for closer integration. The EU ambassador mentioned several times issues around food security. And, you didn't hear that from EU ambassadors in recent years. But now it's in that political agenda, it's in that political debate. So I think there's now a will on lots of sides to make this happen. And we kind of need to capitalise on that, is probably the statement I'm trying to make. And yes, there'll be a negotiation, but I think both sides want to get to a better place. And it's about us collectively making sure that Scotland's interests and the interests of individual sectors and the unforeseen or the unintended consequence of some things are actually thought through properly. So, I again, going back to opening statements, I see this very positive, and we've got to make the most of it, but go in with our eyes open, and also the fact that the EU wants something out of this as well. They want our product. They want that closer integration.
Thank you. I'm going to move on now to questions from Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Scott Walker touched on this already a wee bit about maintaining regulatory regimes or looking at inspections and borders. Working with Food Standards Scotland, for instance, is part of what I suppose what we need to do. So I'm interested in what your thoughts are about financial, regulatory or workforce support that your businesses need to navigate changes resulting from this SPS agreement.
Scott, do you want to kick off?
Yeah. So I'm going to go slightly wider than just this agreement, because I could draw a good example just now. So the regulations that come out of Europe is something that all businesses need to deal with. And in essence, we'd like to have a partnership both with the UK government and Scottish government in terms of how we deal with it, because it's the governments who negotiate with Europe, who discuss with Europe, and it's businesses who ultimately have to implement those rules. We have a set of rules coming out from Europe just now, EUDR, deforestation regulations, where every country has to have a competent authority in terms of those negotiations. And I'm going to describe it as we've been thwarted, rejected, ignored time after time in terms of discussions with the UK government to say we need the UK government to appoint a competent authority to ensure that the rules and regulations we have here in the UK meets the requirements that Europe needs. And what the UK government has time and time again done is put that back to it's up to business to come up with the rules. And as we've said to them, we can come up with the rules, but you've got to get them signed off by Europe. So I use that as a live example just now. In terms of these regulatory regimes going forward, that there'll be more of those things. So business has knowledge, business has expertise, but we really need to work hand in hand with government. Another example I would give just now, and Food Standards Scotland, again, don't want to seem too supportive of Food Standards Scotland, but I'm going to sing their praises just now, is we've talked about the export health certificates that have to accompany every shipload that goes across to Europe just now. That's either signed by a private vet, or in Scotland's situation, a lot of them are signed from vets who are employed by Food Standards Scotland. That piece of work will disappear when these new rules come into place. And already we know that a lot of the private vets who are employed to do that work are saying, well, we won't be needed. We'll look for employment elsewhere. Now, the big concern for the meat industry is if a lot of those people leave the industry just now before the rules come into place, we're physically not going to have enough people to actually sign those export health certificates. So what will be good news down the line could actually cause a big stumbling block in the interim. Now, in discussions with Food Standards Scotland, I think, and again, I think this is where business, the regulations, the industry needs to work together, because it's not in the country's interest if we can't export, because if we can't export, we won't be able to employ. If we're not able to employ, we won't be paying tax, etc., etc. Food Standards Scotland have indicated that they may have the capacity to fill any gaps that exist. So again, that's another example just now in terms of that regulation burden, which will change in due course. In terms of, last thing, in terms of financial help, and I'll pick up on the point that Patrick said, is that we're starting from a zero start again in terms of some sectors, so in terms of seed potatoes getting back into Europe. And again, I think this is where collaboration could help in terms of how do we promote our products across in Europe? How do we bring European partners, say, across to Scotland, because what they're interested in is the certification process that we have in Scotland for seed potatoes to show their high health status. So again, government working with industry, working with the regulatory body, SASA, to promote the high health status and the regimes and practices we have in place so that importers can fully understand that. I think that will be important going forward.
Okay, thanks. I should probably just say just now, this will be the last question that we've got in SPS before moving on to fishes quotas negotiations. If anybody would like to say any more or make sure we get it on record, I've got Jennifer and then I'll go to David.
No, thank you. Just to inform the committee that what's been set out in the Common Understanding document is under consideration by our board and senior management team today in Aberdeen. It's just a coincidence that the two dates collided. But that point around, we have the rules as they are now. They apply. The requirements apply now. The certification applies now. So what, part of the thinking will need to be around about how do we make sure we can deliver our statutory obligations now, but how also to plan for what the future might bring under this deal. And Scott will be well aware of the challenges regarding workforce, because so many of our OVs are EU nationals too, so that's a sort of stress on the system if there's any pull away from that pool and by way of resource. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
So on regulation, what Jenny is alluding to there is we expect there to be significant burden on the civil service, actually, UK level and at Scottish level, in terms of implementation of any regulations, and particularly if there is a quick timescale, which all of us would want, I think, and also presumably a parliamentary burden on yourselves as well. And I think my kind of aim in intervening in this part of the debate is to say, as I said, around dynamic alignment, we expect there to be lots of winners, but there is the likelihood that there will be some people who don't do as well out of what this deal would be. And I guess it's incumbent on governments and parliaments to keep an eye on that as the deal develops, as we get the detail. And we understand better which industries will be more directly impacted. And as I said, around dynamic alignment going forward, that's going to be a continual process as potential for new European regulation comes in.
Jimmy and then Stephen.
For me, I just want to support what Jenny and David have both said and how critical this is to the seafood supply chain. Because if there is any restriction at our side, i.e. with vets and being able to move live crustacean and time-sensitive product, then it will come at a cost to business, not only short-term, but long-term, because the damage is if we can't supply our customers, we lose our customers. Customers, the easiest thing they do is, if you don't supply, they find an alternative solution. So I think there's a huge pressure on yourselves and the officials that to ensure that there is continuity right along the way for this in any further negotiations, because it's important. People need to be protected, and that includes those who are doing a critical job at the point of departure. Thank you.
Stephen.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to touch on, before we finish this section, just a few sectors which hadn't been mentioned. One, our fish feed sector. They have a large export business which is currently encumbered by export health certificates, so I would think that would be freed up quite a lot. Estimate that that's worth over 100 million a year. Also the seed sector in Scotland, exporting seed has been a lot more challenging than it once was. Getting the certificates used to take 4 days, they now take up to 8 weeks. And animal feed, particularly into Ireland, a lot of that trade would have stopped because it was just too hard, logistics and export health certificates. So we would anticipate some of that becoming easier, less costly, and hopefully get some of the lost trade back.
Thank you. Patrick.
Just to go back to a point I raised earlier, it's probably inevitable that there will be a requirement for additional phytosanitary certification. So therefore, the pressure will be on plant health inspectors to issue them on a timely basis. So therefore, making sure that we have an adequate resource in certain areas in Scotland, certainly the seed potato growing areas, to make sure that we can meet that demand and get product out the door as quickly as possible. And then just finally to echo Scott's point about businesses will need, going from a standing start, businesses will need that market support, market development support, and that's going to be crucial moving forward to make sure that we do that in a collaborative manner.
Okay, thank you. James.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just not to repeat, but to support what's just been said in terms of having that smooth transition. Sort of on leaving the European Union, there was a huge amount of investment to set up the new regimes, and that will there'll be a certain amount of disruption when those regimes change. But the overarching piece will be that it will create efficiencies. So support from the committee for the UK government, Scottish government and officials to work at pace to iron out the devil in the detail would be very welcome indeed.
Thank you. If there's no other questions or comments on SPS, what I intend to do is suspend for 5 minutes for a comfort break. We'll resume at 10:30 and we'll move on to quota share and access agreements. Okay, I suspend this meeting. Thank you, and welcome back. We're now going to move on to questions which focus on quota shares and access agreements. So my first question is to ask the panel what the reactions are and main concerns regarding extension of the terms of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement on access and quota shares in 2038, given that some spokespeople suggested it was a complete capitulation. So on that, I'll maybe ask Elspeth on our views to kick off.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. And yes, indeed, you have clearly read our sort of public commentary on the deal on fisheries that was agreed, that was announced, I should say, on the day of the summit on the 19th of May. And it's, I think it's pertinent and relevant that we've spent the last hour or so talking about the SPS agreement, because I think it was very evident from the fact that the EU insisted on there being a deal on access to waters nailed down and finalised before they would get to the common understanding position of even having an agreement, to have a discussion about an agreement on SPS. So I think that tells its own story. I think Johnny said a few minutes ago, you know, both sides want to get to a better place. The world has changed a bit. But, of course, the EU required the UK to essentially pay for this by giving up control of access to our waters for a staggering period of time, absolutely staggering. So we again touched on in the earlier discussion the fact that had the original provisions of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the fisheries heading, had the original provisions come into play come 2026. We're currently in this adjustment period on access to waters and share of quota. But had the default provisions of the TCA been allowed to take place, then we would then have had some greater degree of control over the EU's access into the UK EEZ. We would have had the potential ability to leverage a fairer share of the fishing opportunities in our own water, which would have provided more raw material for our own domestic processing fleet, as Jimmy talked about. But that has now been, the stroke of a pen has gone. That is off the table. Fisheries are not in the position of farmers where you can choose to rear more livestock or not. We are very heavily regulated by tax and quotas. So the agreement on access in relation to fisheries was devastatingly bad for our sector and far worse than we had anticipated. We had strongly argued to the UK Government that moving into that default position of annual negotiations, which is the international norm, albeit what the TCA set out would still have had one of our hands tied behind our backs. It would not have been a normal coastal states relationship in the normal sense, but it would have given us leverage. It would have given us the opportunity to have more of that, as I say, catch in our own waters for our own fleet. That is gone. That will not now be the case until 2038.
So what are the practical knock-on effects of this? And I suppose I'll come to you again, Elspeth, but you know, Jimmy as well. What's it going to look like in our coastal communities and in our processing when we look at this agreement standing until 2038?
Well, it gives little opportunity for us to improve things. We will not be able to increase the share of the catch that the UK has, other than through perhaps some arrangements that we might have with other coastal states, with Norway, for example, with the Faroe Islands. But we are now locked into a very dysfunctional relationship with the EU for another 12 years that will limit the ability of our fleet to make use of the sort of latent catching capacity that it has. It will limit the amount of raw material going into processors. So, and I think it's also important not just to look at these arrangements in isolation from that sort of wider policy landscape on fisheries, where we see a great deal of other pressures on the fleet, whether that's spatial exclusion from large areas of the sea for reasons of conservation or for expansion of offshore wind energy. Layering all of those different policies and outcomes together, I think, makes it hard for our sector to see significant opportunity for growth in the short to medium term.
What impact would that have on states out with Europe? So individual negotiations with Norway or Iceland, will it have an unintended impact on how those negotiations might take place?
Well, I mean, certainly one of the clear benefits that came from the original TCA and has been retained is that the UK now has its own seat at the international negotiating table. When we were within the EU negotiated on the UK's behalf, as it did for all other member states, and the UK was not at the international table. We now are, and that does allow us to have a very different and a more normalised relationship with Faroe, with Norway, with other sort of what we call the coastal states. So I think it's possibly difficult to say exactly what the outcome of the sort of 12-year, what impact the 12-year agreement will have on those relationships going forward. But what remains very important and remains critical for us to try and maximise what opportunities we do have is that we have our own seat at the table, and that must be retained.
Jimmy, from your perspective and security and confidence in the processing side, is this going to have an impact on your sector?
I would think without a doubt it will, because one of the fears we would have to configure in is, will the fishing community continue to invest? If you're in your 40s or in your 50s, are you encouraged to invest in the future that has now been put on hold for a 12-year period? So that means the opportunity of more raw material coming to our shores from our own fleet will be restricted. And therefore, that is significant. That said, I think we now have to look at how do we add, I keep saying, add value to that product that is coming on shore, and I think we've got to really focus and say, right, this is the deal. As much as we would like to undo it, how do we now maximise the added value to that so that our communities can thrive, and therefore that money feeds back into the fishing community so that we can keep them at sea during this period until there is such times as of a possible reset in the future.
Okay, thanks. So suppose, moving on, my next question is about what expectations the fishing industry would have in regards to future negotiations and future engagement with the UK government, given how important the fishing sector is to Scotland and as part of the UK as a whole. Elspeth, can you tell us what engagement you've had with Steve Reid from the UK government? And I understand that you've written to the Prime Minister on 3 different occasions, 2 before the deal and 1 after. What sort of response have you had, and what are your expectations on how things will move forward?
Yes, interesting. We have had very little engagement directly with Steve Reid. We've had lots of engagement with DEFRA. Some very good officials in DEFRA on the fisheries side. Cannot fault them. Really knowledgeable, skilled, good people. We've had a lot of contact with Daniel Zeichner, Minister for Rural Affairs and Food Security, but not a great deal of access to the Secretary of State, other than when he has wanted to perhaps have a quick call about something. We have tried to encourage him to come to the North East, or to any part of Scotland, indeed, to see what the Scottish fishing industry looks like, but he has not yet been able to take up that invitation. And that is not just a criticism in relation to Scotland, actually. I know that my colleagues south of the border feel the same, sort of lack of attention from the DEFRA Secretary of State on fisheries matters. In relation to my letters to the Prime Minister, I have indeed written to him 3 times, and I await a response to any of my letters.
Okay. What role do you think the industry has in lobbying or working with the Scottish Government for the Scottish Government to make their position clear on future trade agreements?
Well, I think it was quite evident from the Scottish Government's reaction to the summit that they felt that they had not been sufficiently engaged. And when the UK Government was elected, just, what was that, about a year ago, both governments spoke at the time of there being you know, a reset of relationships between UK and Scottish governments. It was all going to be better. They were going to work better together. We still hear that, but I don't know that we necessarily see or feel that.
Okay, thanks. Jimmy, do you want to comment?
No, just I think it is difficult. Yes, engagement with the UK government is challenging. We have direct lines with DEFRA, as Elspeth alluded to. We're somehow different because although we are very tied to fisheries, our matters are really business matters, and therefore we can never really get home to park our problems. But that said, the Scottish Government have been very open and welcoming in the last few months, and we will use that opportunity to lobby that way.
Okay, thank you. Adam?
Again, to echo what has already been said, engagement at an official level is strong, and we have some. We work with some very decent people who are very capable in the work that they do. And we also have relatively good engagement with both the Scotland Office and DEFRA with the Fisheries Minister. However, it does feel that at a ministerial level that their hands are tied by the centre, and that they don't actually have the ability to make decisions within their portfolio and their remit, and that they are very much governed by the centre, and that they don't really have much of a say on what goes on within their own brief.
Okay, thanks. Elspeth, I know you want to come back. You maybe want to consider where has this failed? Where has the breakdown been? Because ultimately fishing is hugely important to Scotland, but it would appear that there's been very little recognition given to that as part of this trade deal, and it would suggest there's a breakdown in communication. Where is it going wrong?
I don't know so much there's been a breakdown in communication. I think the point I wanted to add was that not only clearly have we been engaging with ministers and officials in DEFRA, but also in the Cabinet Office. We have had a number of meetings and opportunities to talk to Nick Thomas-Symonds, who of course was leading the brief on this whole picture. Within the Cabinet Office, and as Adam has alluded to, obviously keeping the Secretary of State for Scotland completely in the loop. So there was certainly no reason by which any of the key departments in the UK government would have felt that they didn't know what our position was. I think we had made that very clear. Indeed, that was some of the feedback I did get from Steve Reid, was that our position had been consistent and had been very clear and had been heard. But it's one thing being heard, it's another thing action being taken in relation to what you hear. So I don't think there was a failure of communication. I think it was simply that the EU, we know, will always play hardball on access to UK waters for their fishing fleet because they are so highly dependent upon it. And it was very evident from this common understanding statement that that had to be locked down before they would get to the point of even having an agreement to discuss other agreements. And it's an interesting document here. It's peppered with language around things being of mutual benefit, things being in balance. But when you look at the arrangement in fishery, it is anything but being of mutual benefit or being in balance. Essentially, the EU fleet will take probably, even just at today's prices and without any value added, the EU will take probably about £6 billion worth of fish from the UK EEZ over the next 12 years. And the Scottish fleet fishes very little in EU waters, and that is not a balanced or equitable agreement.
So it just sounds like the UK Labour government thought that was a price worth paying for additional concessions in the UK-EU deal.
That is certainly a conclusion that one could draw, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Tim Eagle.
I think this has slightly been touched on, Elspeth, but I guess in an ideal world, which we don't live in, but in an ideal world, if we had one, when you balance the need for that trading relationship, with Europe and around the world, but particularly with Europe in this, what would have, in your mind, that arrangement look like? I mean, we talked about you mentioned annual negotiations, but in terms of the quota, what might that have looked like?
Well, what we always said back before the TCA was originally agreed back in 2020 was that there were essentially three things that in an ideal world you would have on a fisheries agreement. You would have full control over access to your waters, because that's what every independent coastal state has now, apart from the UK, which does not have that. You would move towards a system on arrangement of fishing opportunities of quota shares that was based on what we call zonal attachment, which is a scientific way of assessing essentially where fish spend most of their time. Fish are not like cattle and sheep in fields, they move around. So there's quite complex ways in which you can assess actually what a country's share of a particular fish stock might be. Professor Fernandez here is particularly knowledgeable on this matter. And the other thing that would be critically important would be to have regulatory autonomy. So essentially you set your own rules in your own waters. Again, what every coastal state would expect to be able to do. The government has failed on control of access to waters, has failed in relation to the EU. We can obviously still control access to waters for other fleets, Norway and Faroe being case in point. We are not in a position now where we have any type of sharing arrangement on fishing opportunities that is based on the principle of zonal attachment. And we do have regulatory autonomy, but as I said in the earlier session, I am concerned about the discussions on dynamic alignment I think, present some risks if that is not very carefully controlled and managed to make sure that that does not go too far upstream in terms of primary production and does not start to suck the UK back into the confines of the common fisheries policy. And I also just want to say, we absolutely recognise the importance of an SPS agreement to many businesses and to many sectors who are represented here today. We absolutely see that, and it will indeed also be of significant value to many seafood businesses. I don't want anybody to be under any illusion that we don't see the value of that. But our beef with it, if I can use that pun, is the fact that the price to be paid for it appears to have been giving away that access to our waters for 12 years.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Beatrice, did you have a supplementary? No. Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. Are we fully utilising our quotas, and are there fleet sectors that could be developed to increase quota uptake?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because when the TCA was agreed back in 2020 under Boris Johnson, there was a transfer of quota to the UK. It was a strange mixture of things. So certainly there was a transfer of fish that we will catch, but there was also quite significant transfer of what we would call sort of paper fish. So fish that certainly our fleet and in fact I think other parts of the UK fleet don't catch, don't have the right fleet structure for them. So we had this transfer of fish on paper, but are not stocks that are perhaps of commercial value to the UK or that the fleet is equipped to be catching. So for those stocks that that are commercially valuable and we have to catch what there is a market for, what the processors want, what the market wants, whether that's export market or domestic market. There will be there would have been some transfers back in 2020 of fish that will not have been caught because there isn't a market for them or the fleet is not structured to catch them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Jimmy.
If I may, and this is something that's happening real time, is we have an invasion of octopus in the southwestern approaches to the United Kingdom that is eating all the crustacean. Apparently it did happen once before, back in 1958, which is before I was born. And we don't know, is this a one-off or is this a new approach of something that's happening environmentally? And it's now in the Western English Channel,
but could transfer right through the channel into the North Sea. So these are risks, environmental risks, that we have no control over. And therefore, the fishermen, the crustacean, the creel caught fishermen, are having a real difficult time because it's eating all the lobsters and crabs and scallops, whilst the trawl fishermen are having an absolute bonanza because it is a very high value species. So these are things that sometimes happen environmentally that are totally out of our control. So who's to say what tomorrow brings? I just thought that may be worth mentioning. It's something that's happening real time right now.
Elspeth.
I think the other, just coming back to your question, the other thing that's relevant is that there certainly will be fisheries that could be developed, but sometimes there are sort of regulatory barriers to why that maybe can't develop as quickly as we would like. Despite what you might have the impression from reading some of the press, our fishing industry in the UK and in Scotland is highly regulated and is highly controlled, and you can't just go and start a new fishery because you see something that you might see an opportunity for. It requires regulatory arrangements for that. And I think one of the things that we do need to think about, and that I think is relevant to this Parliament, is making sure that the Scottish Government's fishery policy landscape allows there to be that exploration and sensible development of opportunities for new fisheries, and that they do not just get bogged down in bureaucracy and regulation that is disabling rather than enabling.
So flexibility really is the key, isn't it?
Yes, and I think we'll have to do that increasingly because we know that our planet is changing, we know our climate is changing. Jimmy's just spoken about the octopus coming into the southwest approaches. We see changes in the distribution of fish in our waters, yet we have a pretty rigid regulatory system for the stocks that we've had for the last 30, 40 or 50 years. We need to make sure that we've got a fisheries management system for the future that enables flexibility around those environmental changes that we see. I mean, for example, we see increasingly, a bluefin tuna off the west coast of Scotland. Is that a fishery that could be exploited, that could be developed? So it's about, we need that adaptive management to make sure that we're able to exploit those opportunities for the future.
Just to be clear, so the potential removal of the TCA on negotiations on an annual basis, on what Jimmy's suggesting is that we've got environmental, climate change or whatever challenges. Does that put the industry at a risk? Is the ability for the deal to be flexible to address some issues like that being taken away, and rather we've got multi-year, which actually would come at a cost to the industry?
We will still sit down annually with the EU to talk about essentially what's the total allowable catch, what should we be catching this year of stock X, Y or Z, and in some forums we'll do that with other partners as well. We'll do it with Norway, sometimes other countries like Iceland and Greenland might be involved, depends on the stock. But there will be, insofar as those discussions relate to the EU, they are now very constrained to quite technical issues, and certainly not, as I say, the ability for the UK to leverage more. I think it is fair to say that the processes, whether these are EU-UK ones or just within the UK, to actually start to look at, how can we find more other opportunities, flexibility for the future? How do we adapt to this changing climate? We have a structure set up under the TCA called Specialised Committee on Fisheries. And that's a forum whereby many of the technical things that are discussed between the UK and the EU and fisheries are sort of remitted to this committee to go away and find solutions to. But it's very slow moving. Industry is completely shut out from it. We are not involved in those discussions. We hear what's on the agenda and we get a very anodyne readout of it afterwards. But it's not something that there is proper, genuine stakeholder involvement in, and I think that's a real constraint.
Okay. I'm going to bring Jimmy and then back to Evelyn for a follow-up.
I think it's just using my own career as an example of what you're saying, should we have flexibility?
when I started fishing as a young lad in 1976, there was great opportunity catching cod, haddock, whiting, a big range of whitefish species. Come up to the millennium, when I was then a skipper, I had to make a significant career change, and that was to stop fishing these species because the pressure was coming on them, and have the flexibility within a Scottish fishery to change my method of fishing and to concentrate on nethrop and langoustine catching. And it was because that flexibility was there, the industry was able to transgress across a fishery to allow the fishing to continue, the communities to continue, and the stocks that were under pressure so is that if the flexibility is in there, as the environment changes, the fishermen and the communities will change with it. If you have a rigid system, then that's when you would be facing catastrophic failure, and I think that's put simple.
Okay, Evelyn.
Jimmy, I just wanted to ask the issue with the octopus coming into that area. How sort of long has that taken to happen?
I think it's just something that's happened this season. I think it's been very, very quickly. They're coming up from warmer waters. So does that mean the southwestern approaches are getting warmer, or are the octopus hungry and they're chasing food? I mean, that is ultimately it's the food chain that really supplies the stocks. If there's no food, stocks will move elsewhere. And I think octopus is either changing. It's either the water temperature, food chain, or a combination of both. But is it a one-off? Well, we don't know. As I said, someone told me yesterday it happened in 1958, which is considerable time ago. But I think we need to see time on this one.
Yeah. Thank you.
I was going to say something very similar. Sorry, it was on farming today, and it's come in very quickly, and they don't know what's caused it, but they've just arrived in their droves and decimated the crab and lobster fishermen because they can get into the pots and eat the crabs.
Okay, thank you. Beatrice.
Thank you. Just looking at this from another angle, what potential benefits might the agreement bring, such as improving exports to the EU and more EU vessels landing catches into Scottish ports and fish processors, which we've heard about earlier? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, as I said a moment ago, I think, we do see that potentially having an SPS agreement, depending on what it looks like, and the devil will be in the detail, is of benefit to both parties. But that should not, the price to be paid for that should not be giving up access to our waters for a period of 12 years. In terms of I think, as we said in the earlier session, I don't think either Jimmy or I would, or indeed Adam, would have much sense of whether the EU fleet will change how they operate, whether they'll perhaps just continue to land their fish into the EU, or whether they will land it in Scotland, but it will be trucked straight to the EU and won't be processed here. So I don't think we have a sense of how that might change, or if it will change. Mm-hmm.
Jimmy?
I think it is the loss of the economic benefit to Scotland if these vessels continue to fish for 12 years and that economic benefit does not come back to our Scottish shores. I think that's a lost opportunity. I would like to see something that would encourage that to happen, because we do need the raw material if we need to grow our sector, and we need people to seek careers in seafood and processing. It is a skillful job, but we cannot have an industry that hasn't got a future for 12. I'm not saying it's not got a future, but it's got restrictions for 12 years. Does not encourage youth to seek that as a job, career, and opportunity. So, I would like to see some sort of encouragement for the raw material to come through our ports, even if it's the landings, but even better if the fish was being processed here. But it is sad it comes at the cost of our own fleet.
I suppose going back to what you said in the earlier session was that it's unlikely, if there was an increase in EU landings, that they'd actually be processed in Scotland, because the cost of doing business here, it's not a level playing field. So even though there may be some benefits from the change in the quota, it's not likely that processors in Scotland are going to be able to benefit from that.
classic example would be access to labour. If we were looking at EU countries, they will have the access to a bigger labour pool. Therefore, in the primary processing, they will be much more competitive. The system we've now adopted, if we need to migrate people here with the skills that can do the job, that's hugely costly. And we understand that the government's policy for that is to try and make everyone equal and fair. But unfortunately, it makes us uncompetitive in a European and global market. And that is where our market is.
Thank you. Elspeth.
Yes, I think just one further point to make on that was around obviously having the EU fleet continuing to fish in our waters for another 12 years, and who knows what might happen beyond that point, adds to the spatial pressure on our seas. So as we routinely and consistently say to both Scottish and UK governments when thinking about looking at the spatial pressures on fishing, it is not just about the UK fleet, it is not just about the Scottish fleet, it's about all the fleets that fish in our waters. And we know that the EU fleet will be as exercised about many of the sort of policies that are coming through now in UK and Scottish waters that will have a spatial constraint. But that is going to, I think, increase pressure in terms of potentially conflict between fleets being squeezed into smaller and perhaps less productive areas.
So much of that spatial squeeze, or adapting to that, or mitigating it, will be down to the Scottish Government. Are you comfortable that the Scottish Government are aware of the potential impact over 12 years when it comes to offshore cabling and whatever? Is that something that you're actively lobbying the Scottish Government about?
We're certainly actively lobbying the Scottish Government about that, and the Scottish Government, I think, is looking at that through the work that it's doing, for example, on the sectoral marine plan for offshore wind that is out to consultation at the moment. But the point that we keep making to the government is you can't just look at this through the lens of one policy. You have to layer these things together, whether it's conservation, whether it's subsea cables, whether it's offshore wind, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's aquaculture, all of these things combined. And I think there is an intention that they want to now have a look at what this cumulative spatial pressure looks like, although industry has actually already done some work on that 2 or 3 years ago, which I think set out very starkly what that might look like in the future.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell.
So, given what we've talked about in terms of, the need for flexibility and, responding to opportunities and, the need to look at processing as well, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the UK government's announcement on the Fishing and Coastal Growth Fund, about 360 million. Where do you think that should be prioritised? What do you think will be the outcome of that? Do you think we could see an increase in the Scottish fleet or increased investment in processing? I mean, what kind of discussions have you had already about that, or what do you anticipate or hope will come out of that?
Yes, thank you. That's a really relevant question, because when the summit, on the day of the summit, when the common understanding was announced and the arrangement on fisheries that had been reached was announced, rather like a rabbit out of a hat, the UK government found money to say here's a £360 million fund for fishing and coastal growth. And that 360 million, however, is not 360 million over the course of this Parliament. It will be £30 million a year over each of the 12 years. So I asked Steve Reid whether he thought that future governments would uphold make that would uphold the commitment that his government had made to something should they not be in office beyond the next general election. So we do have concerns that that 360 million may not indeed materialise, depending on what decisions any future government might make. I think the key thing for us is that fishing is the main target of that fund. We had a discussion with Daniel Zeissner, DEFRA Minister, yesterday, with other fishing bodies across the UK, and I think we were very clear that this fund has been made, whatever it looks like in the long term, has been made available in the context of the fishing deal with the EU, which is very much to the UK's disadvantage. So we would very much be wanting to see that scheme targeted at fishing and not at things that may be unrelated. I mean, there was mention perhaps of things like tourism or so I think it's very important that the fisheries sector is the key beneficiary of that. And I think a lot of the things we've talked about today will indeed be sort of in our thinking. UK government wants to have more detailed discussions with the industry about what the priorities would be, and there will, I'm sure, be different priorities from different parts of the country and indeed from different parts of the fleet. But we certainly want to be engaged with government in how we make best use of that, and we make best use of that to help support our industry.
Just to support what Elspeth has said, it is a large sum of money, but when you filter it down over 12 years, but for myself and the sector that I represent, I keep saying that we are now stuck with the quota which will be for the next 12 years. So I think we should be focusing on how do we add value, because we are the only sector now that can add value to that limited resource. And it is the investment going in to make sure that our fisheries, through the processing, is fed back to the fishermen so that they can remain in place whilst this transition goes through, and that we grow our economic activity and communities through the investment of making ourselves more efficient. We all want cheap food. Everyone wants it. But it will be driven through efficiency and cost reducing on labour-intensive roles. And therefore, innovation, some of that money needs to go in to make sure that our communities can thrive and not just survive.
Yeah. Just on that point around, cost reduction, are you disappointed there wasn't in this agreement something on free movement of labour? Because presumably free movement of labour, as you've already indicated, I think benefits you in terms of processing jobs and other jobs.
Free movement of labour would have been an added bonus to this for sure. The one thing that we struggle in all primary, and I'm not just speaking about seafood, but I would right across primary food production, is getting people to work in the industry, and it's. I was at a previous committee meeting a few weeks ago where our Scottish population, I didn't realise the Scottish population is decreasing rapidly, and therefore we are more and more dependent on migrants coming to live in our country and help us grow the economy and fill the voids that our own people no longer see desirable. So I think that's a lost opportunity.
Yeah. Elspeth, does your organisation have a view on that?
Sorry, Adam was the one to come in.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry,
Adam, go for it.
Just to bolster the points already made, around £360 million over 12 years, £30 million per year. So 12 years ago, if £30 million 12 years ago would be worth £43.8 million today. So in real terms, that goes down every year. So that is, that is a significant worry. But what I would say is, whilst there have been no details around this fund, I would say that DEFRA officials are actively engaging, and they are. It's encouraging that they're keen to make this work for the industry, where the previous fund that they managed, they're quite keen to learn from mistakes made, or maybe not necessarily mistakes, but they're keen to make sure that the money goes to the right places.
Elspeth?
In relation to labour, certainly parts of our fishing industry struggle to have sufficient labour. It's quite a mixed bag across the country and across different fleet sectors. I think, bearing in mind the sort of wider government pressures and policies around wider immigration are clearly pertinent in what is or isn't in the common understanding. I think what is a concern are some of the UK Government proposals in their white paper on immigration. I think also some of the language in that paper is of concern. So I think certainly workforce, I think probably many of us around the table today involved in food production, whether that's primary production or processing, are probably in quite a similar position in terms of workforce is an ongoing concern. And I think I know we certainly struggle with the sort of conflicting messages from government coming about, we're all about growth, we're all about growing the economy, but then not giving businesses actually the tools that are needed to grow the economy.
Just on that, we've previously, as part of our budget scrutiny, looked at the role of Marine Directorate. And one of the concerns was that the Marine Directorate didn't appear to be focusing on exactly what you're talking about, growth, innovation, exploiting sustainably other fish stocks. For example, we've seen an increase in sea bass. We know that the industry has benefited from increasing quota from monkfish. And there's a call for octopus fishery in Shetland, and in my region there's ongoing calls for work to be done to open up the cockle fishery, which independently has been assessed to have been worth between 3 and 6 million to the local economy in Dumfries and Galloway. So, and we've had a delay in fishing management plans, and I know SFF are keen that it's done right. But given your call for that 360 million to be spent on fishing, do you think the Marine Directorate is heading in the right direction? Has it got the right priorities to ensure that we can diversify our fishing industry, to take advantage of other fish stocks that are there at the moment?
I think probably Marine Directorate have maybe too many priorities, and it's quite hard for them to prioritise between these priorities. And this probably touches on some of the things that Jenny spoke about in the earlier session about the additional responsibilities that have come to government from leaving the EU. You've got very different functions, and those are functions that you can't get away from. They become responsibilities, as well as a very ambitious programme of sort of domestic policy. We'd like to have, a blue economy vision, a blue economy action plan, so I think we sometimes feel that we're spinning plates with the number of visions, strategies, consultations, action plans that we're dealing with that are all sort of related, but it's sometimes hard to see how they all fit together. And I think, as is the case with many bits of government, resources are under pressure and they will not be able to do everything. So Scottish Government, Marine Directorate certainly set out in the programme for government a number of things that they see as priorities, but that doesn't mean that the other things that are also priorities have gone away. So there's something very much about, I think, them being able to map their priorities against their resources and be very clear about what it is that they're going to actually take forward, and doing that in consultation and in engagement with industry.
Thank you. Jimmy.
I would just like to add to that is that, yes, there are great opportunities in the coastal regions. And what we need to do is ensure that where the opportunities arise, that government have the correct policies across its agenda to ensure that we've got the right amount of affordable housing in these areas. Because sometimes it's not just a case we can't get people because of the attraction of tourism, which is driving prices up for white settlers, to use an expression. People are coming in, they've got huge sums of money, they're buying up these properties and they're using them as holiday homes, which is absolutely great for that economy, but it comes at a cost of the local fishing communities who can no longer attract people to come and seek employment opportunities and settle there because of the lack of housing. So it's joining up other policies that allow the marine side of the sector, our great coastline right across the islands, the west coast, the east coast. We've got the richest fishing grounds in the world, and we should be really focusing on making sure the whole supply chain from sea to plate is well advanced.
Thank you. Okay, that completes all the questions. So thank you everybody for your contributions this morning. They've been hugely helpful. I now move into private session and I suspend the meeting for 5 minutes. Thank you.